Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Alliance for Sustainable Building Products 5th Healthy Building Conference 2021. So we've got a great program today, 6 fantastic speakers, and so I'll introduce them as they come through. So we've got 2 sessions and a bit of a comfort break to get up and move around and have a quick cup of tea in between. So a jam-packed morning, lots of fun. Please keep your questions coming in, and I'll go through that in a second. So later on this afternoon at 3 o'clock, we've got our Alliance for Sustainable Building Products Innovation Pitch Series final. So all of these companies you can see represented there have won their previous heats, and now it's the grand finale, and they're all pitching against each other to find the sort of most innovative product to reduce plastics in construction, because we are concerned about how much plastic is used in construction. We're looking at ways in which we can reduce that. And then tomorrow afternoon, we've got our awards. So we've got 6 fabulous contenders for our awards. I'm so pleased I'm not judging, because that's going to be so difficult to judge. They all deserve to win. So that's tomorrow afternoon. Both free events, this afternoon and tomorrow, are free. So just sign up on the Eventbrite via our website, or if you can't do that, drop my colleague Larry a note and he'll add you to the list. So I would like to thank all of our sponsors. We couldn't do it without you. So thank you so much. So Velux has been our gold sponsor this year, Barico our silver sponsor, Varston Timber and Healthy Property Group. And I know most of you are probably in the audience today, so a huge thank you to all of you. Thank you. So a few instructions. These look quite complex, but ultimately, if you've got any questions, put them in the Q&A. And if you see a question that's a bit like your question, don't ask another question similar, just upvote that question, and we'll deal and we'll take the questions that are most popular, that have the most upvotes. So Professor Kath Notes is with us for until about 11. So we'll take a few questions after her session, and then she'll be able to answer any more questions that come through on the Q&A live. So we'll do that, and so we'll take a few questions after each speaker. So if we ask your question, we'll ask to unmute you, and so you can ask it yourself. Don't use the raise the hand option, because no one's paying any attention to that. If you've got any technical issues, just use the chat. So we are recording this, so do bear that in mind. So just a reminder, the Alliance for Sustainable Building Products, we're a not-for-profit mission-led membership organisation, and that's our mission there. So what do? We're a knowledge-sharing organisation, and we share this learning through our events and through briefing papers. We aim to take complex subjects and simplify them, which is a skill in itself. We aim to push knowledge and learning through research. We're looking at product standards, for example, EPDs and standards like Nature Plus, and we respond to consultations and much more besides. We've got these 6 pillars that we call of work streams, but the idea is to knit these work streams together. So we must remember that health and well-being is very much a part of resource efficiency and so on, and part of whole life carbon too. So we believe that a healthy building starts from a healthy product, and we believe a healthy planet starts from a healthy product. So it's all really starting from the product. So we launched in 2011 at the Palace of Westminster with just 9 members. That's Gary, our executive chair, looking a little bit nervous, but he did a great job. He's with us in the audience today. Today we've got over 80 members, and we're looking to get to 100 by the summer. So that's great. It feels like we've got some sort of credibility. These are our members. I'd like to thank just a few. So Wienerberger have been patrons since the very beginning, have been with us all the way through. We've got steel companies like Cleveland Steel and Tubes here too, as well as leading architects like Archetype and Cullinan Studios, and a range of other organizations, patrons like BWF and TTF and Unity Line, just to name a few. So thank you to all of our members for helping us with our journey. So as I said, this is our 5th Healthy Buildings Conference and Expo. We've had some great speakers over the years, including Professor Stephen Holgate, who's been instrumental in helping Rosamund Kissy-Deborah, who is speaking in our next session, helping her through the process of dealing with the coroner. So it'd be lovely to see everybody in a physical venue. Of course, this time last year we were doing that. It doesn't seem possible that it's just a year ago that we had a hall full of people and we were chatting over a cup of coffee, but it will be back. Just to quickly mention, yes, this is the European flag, hurrah. So we're involved in a European project looking at waste duvets. It's a problematic waste stream, so wondering what we can do with them, and we're going to take some apart, look at the contents and refiberize them, so it's exciting. So do get involved with the Alliance for Sustainable Building Products, join us up as a member, or sign up to our free newsletter, become a sponsor, or get involved in one of our working groups. So keep an eye on our website. And this is our team's growing team. So welcome to Larry Tate, who's newly joined. So just drop us a note if you want to get in touch. So thanks very much. So that's me done. So now I'm going to hand over to Professor Kath Noakes. So if I started reading out Kath's biog, half an hour later, we'd still be going. So her biog is up on our website. So without further ado, I'm going to ask you to share your screen, Kath, and lovely. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Super. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to come and talk today. So I'm worked at the University of Leeds, but for the past, my background's in ventilation and airborne infection, but for the past nearly a year now, I've been involved with the COVID response, and that's opened my eyes quite a lot to thinking about our built environment. So I actually wanted to talk through today, I think, some of the things that we hopefully will learn from this. So start with respiratory disease. The graph on the left-hand side is from WHO. The statistics are a little bit old now, but they don't produce these every year. But if you look at the top 10 global causes of death, you can see that a very high proportion of those are associated with some form of respiratory infection or linked to the built environment. So there are, tuberculosis, low respiratory infections are very clearly in there as specific diseases. But then we've got lung cancers, we've got COPD, we've got stroke, we've got heart disease, and we've got dementia, which have all been associated with air pollution. And to be quite honest, the only one in there which is not linked to the design of our built environment really is road injury. And then if we look at the data so far on coronavirus, which is quite sobering really when you look at it. We're about a year in now, just over a year in, and we've had 2.4 million deaths globally from this disease. You can see that that's going to firmly put coronavirus into the top 10 global causes of death, as it is going to overtake tuberculosis and many other ones down the lower end of the list on the left hand side. So that really shows us that respiratory disease and respiratory conditions are an enormous health challenge. They are something that does dominate our health worldwide. And the link to the built environment, I mean, it's far from new. We go back to the work of Florence Nightingale, we go back to her work on hospitals, and she recognised the importance of the design of the built environment in terms of controlling disease. She flagged, high ceilings, natural light. She worked out the bed spacing. She worked out how much air was needed per person in those spaces. The windows were open year round. Some of these wards were designed in such a way that they had air vents behind radiators to allow air to come in the winter. And she also focused on improvement in sanitary living conditions and the statistical methods to show some of this, that this mattered. It's one thing saying we need this, but you have to be able to prove it and evidence it. And so she was one of the people who evidenced it too. When it comes to actual transmission of respiratory disease, there's a lot of gaps in our knowledge. There are still a lot of gaps in our knowledge. We know that the virus is exhaled in some respect, but exactly how it transmits person to person is quite challenging. We go back to the late 1800s, and Pfluger was one of the first people to kind of really start to think about this in a more mechanistic way, and showed that respiratory droplets contain bacteria, and he showed that they settle on the floor. But then we also started to recognize ventilation. I found this particular paper which really fascinated me about a study on analysing the House of Commons ventilation. And absolutely fascinating. At a turn of the century, they were worried about the bacteria and people's breath. They were also worried about the bacteria that came in on people's feet from the horse muck in the streets. So it shows you just how times have changed. But they recognised that when people were in that debating chamber, they were talking that there was bacterial contamination in the air, and it was due to respiratory exhalations. So when people spoke, coughed, sneezed, etc., and they recognised that then the design of the ventilation system was important for how people were exposed to those pathogens. When it comes to actually evidencing transmission of disease as airborne, though, it's actually pretty challenging. And you know, tuberculosis, if you go back 150 years, you'll see signs about it. You know, don't spit on the floor, lots of concern over droplets, over surfaces, over spitting. It was only in the 1950s, early 60s, that it actually was proven to be airborne. So this was suspected prior, you know, in the 1930s, and one of the advocates of this was a guy called William Wells. He's the guy in the black and white photograph who was at Harvard, who was a bit of a maverick, to be quite honest. He proposed the idea of what he called a droplet nuclei, and he suggested that when people exhale pathogens in their breath, that these particles evaporate, they become smaller, and they become what you call just as droplet nuclei, which was the bacteria surrounded by really quite a small amount of, you know, respiratory fluid that had dried out, and they could stay airborne for long periods. And he carried out with Richard Riley, who's the other guy in the photograph, an experiment in Baltimore where they took the air from a ward, a TB ward, and they passed the air through a ventilation duct through a house of guinea pigs. And over that period of 4 years, their guinea pigs got infected. And the only pathway for their guinea pigs to be infected was the ventilation air. So it showed that TB actually doesn't transmit by spitting on the floor. It transmits by these tiny aerosols, and they also, over years, we've now learned that these are very tiny. They're the smallest ones, 5 microns or so in diameter. They're the ones that can reach the deep lung, the alveoli, because that's the site of infection for tuberculosis. Interestingly, they also put UV air disinfection devices in these wards and showed that that reduced the number of guinea pig infections, so showed that that's potentially quite an effective control. So let's have a look at COVID-19. It's obviously been on everybody's minds for as long as we can remember, feels like forever. When we start thinking about how does it transmit, we realise it gets complicated. So it is respiratory. People exhale it in some respects, but those, we don't know very much about the size of droplets and aerosols that matter. What we think is that they all matter. So unlike tuberculosis, where it's just the tiniest ones, actually they probably all matter, from the large ones through to the very tiniest ones. So that basically means that some of those very small aerosols can be retained in a room, they can be inhaled and create some form of airborne transmission. But we know that also when you're close to somebody, some of the larger aerosols and the droplets, both of those can be inhaled and therefore cause infection that way. Then we know that the very large droplets can potentially, they are ballistic. They might hit your eyes or your nose or your mouth, or they may land onto surfaces. Surfaces can contaminate hands, and then potentially you could be infected via, you know, put your finger up your nose and you've, with the virus on it, you've transferred that virus. So it's actually quite complex. It's not a simple thing, and the whole problem is tied up with how people interact with their environments. We know from the evidence so far, we've got a number of risk factors. So when you're closer to somebody who's infected, you're at a higher risk. It's far more risky to be indoors than outdoors. And we know that there are a number of outbreaks that have been associated with poorly ventilated spaces, although very few that have been associated with well-ventilated spaces. We know that the longer you spend with somebody infectious, the more likely you are to be infected yourself. We also know that certain activities raise the risk. So singing is particularly one that seems to raise the risk of aerosolization of the virus. But alongside that, there's some evidence around high aerobic activity, which may both increase the viral emission and increase people's breathing rates. We know that if you're in a more crowded environment, there's a higher probability that somebody infectious is in there. There's also more people who the infection can pass on to. So it's more likely to result in greater onward transmission. And we know from laboratory studies that the virus survives better when it's at lower temperatures. It survives better at lower humidity, and it survives for much longer in indoor spaces, which tend to be a bit darker compared to if you put it in the outdoor, mid-summer sunshine, where it will survive for only a few minutes on a surface. And we also know the symptoms make this difficult as well. So people who are symptomatic are likely to be a bit more infectious than those who are asymptomatic, but we know that asymptomatic transmission happens. And that means it's really hard to work out who's infectious. You do not have to have a cough, you don't have to have a fever to be infectious. And a lot of people seem to pass on the virus before they show any significant symptoms. I think the other thing we know now as well is this huge variation between people. And some people seem to have a very high viral load and be able to transmit. Others seem to have a much lower viral load and probably rarely transmit. So it's very uneven in its pattern of transmission. How do we know some of this? And this is where it gets difficult, because we don't have a nice, neat study that says this is exactly what happens. And we have to try and put together the evidence from outbreak studies, from population level studies, from our understanding of the environments, and from laboratory studies. So we don't yet know which transmission routes are most important and whether that changes. We do know animal studies show that both air and surfaces could be a possible transmission route, but we don't quite know exactly what the balance of those is and the mechanisms that are at play there. The association with indoors comes from many, many studies which show that there's, outdoor activities. There is outdoor transmission, but it's very limited, and it seems to only be when people are in quite close interaction with each other. We also are growing evidence that sort of suggests that the random surfaces, touch a package in the supermarket, touch your Amazon package has been delivered to your home, there seems to be almost no evidence that transmission happens that way. It really seems to happen when you're in an environment with somebody who's infected or very immediately afterwards, rather than, several hours later. We know that super spreading happens, and that might be quite a big driver for infection. And say already, there's some association with poor ventilation, and even with air conditioning units potentially maintaining aerosols in the air for longer. The other thing we've learned as well is that although it's very tempting to say, well, a hospital is more risky, or the karaoke bar is more risky, or the office is more risky, we know that transmission can happen anywhere. It's anywhere where people come together, it can potentially happen. It's very difficult to work out what's actually going on. So we have a lot of population scale data, but it's quite hard to disaggregate that down to what does that really mean for individuals. And we also know that some of the risk factors make some things more or less risky. So environments which are poorly ventilated, or environments where people are singing or shouting, going to be more risky than others. The other thing we've found as well is that it's not always what it seems. So you might see, for example, an outbreak that appears to be associated with a workplace in the media. Your immediate thought is, were they all in an office together, or were they all in a warehouse together? Actually, when you start looking at it, you realise that some of that transmission happened because those people shared transport together, they socialised together, some live in houses together. And therefore, there's a lot of other mechanisms that enable transmission to happen. So how have we thought about managing this? And this is where we start thinking about the environment. I mean, we're going to manage any disease, we start thinking about it through a risk control perspective. You know, our most effective thing is to say, well, let's not, you know, let's just stop work. We won't do anything. But actually, that's just not sustainable. So we've gone down a more substitution route. We said, let's work at home. Let's look at alternatives to how we can work in the environment and to carry on with our lives with some form of substitution. But there are places where we do have to interact together, and therefore we need effective controls in some of those settings. And the engineering controls, although they often get, we perceive them as the public as a lower priority, they really should be a much higher priority. So things like ventilation, air cleaning, even things like screens and surface technologies and physical layouts are all things that actually, if we get that right, provide a baseline for then the more administrative controls and the things that require human behaviour to work effectively. And you know, you'll notice PPE is at the bottom of the list there. We are in a position with this disease where we have to wear face coverings because we don't have much of the choice, but it sits down the bottom because it requires human behaviour to deliver it correctly, and it's very susceptible to influence of that human behaviour and whether people do it correctly or not. It's also the least sustainable because we don't really all want to live in a society where we wear masks continuously. Thinking about the engineering side of this, a lot of the focus is going to be on the air and how we can manage the airborne risks through change in ventilation, temperature, humidity, air distribution, etc. Bringing in new technologies that could inactivate virus. But we mustn't forget those things about how the environment allows us to reduce our interaction, so the physical layouting that we have in there too. And we also need to remember that interventions need to align to the transmission route. And this is a bit of a messy diagram, but it just shows you some of the different places that these interventions work. So if you're in a workplace and you've got fantastic cleaning and hand hygiene, brilliant, you've tackled the little triangle down the bottom, but you have failed to tackle any of the airborne routes. And you actually need interventions that tackle all of the different transmission routes, and thinking about whether they prevent the infected person from emitting or whether they prevent an susceptible person from being exposed, because there's slightly different factors in there. So over the past year, we've seen a very rapid response. We've looked at in our workplaces, we've changed densities and layouts, we've changed our work patterns, we've very rapidly changed our ventilation systems, we've opened windows and doors galore, we've overridden controls with increased flow rates, we've started to think about applying air cleaners, and of course we've seen a huge campaign around behavioural and personal measures to keep your distance, wear your face covering, wash your hands, etc. The problem is all of these are a sticking plaster solution. These are the things that we've been able to do rapidly and able to do now, but they are not about creating a sustainable system, and they're not about creating a built environment that's going to be effective for the future. And I think that means we've learned a lot of lessons as well. So we've learned that actually we know very little about what the ventilation rate is in most buildings and how that ventilation is designed and how it performs. We have realised that we are not very good at being able to measure that. If somebody says, what is the ventilation? It's actually pretty hard, and it's pretty hard to show what it does and how that varies. We also have had a lot of discussion about what ventilation rates, what environmental conditions are appropriate, and we don't know. We're erring on the side of caution and recommending particular CO2 concentrations in indoor air, but we don't have good metrics for health-based performance. And we've also recognised that things like our buildings, ventilation, and our ways our buildings worked, they link very heavily to our behaviours, and yet we don't. There's not a widespread understanding of how our built environment works. We just sort of take it for granted and we don't think about it. And it's raised a lot of people thinking now that actually they've never given much thought to ventilation, and possibly they ought to. But now they need to know how to think that through and what is important. And I think I've now talked about COVID, but I want to go beyond COVID with this, because actually there is other potentially much bigger problems out there. This is from Public Health England's Health Matters document, which talks about air quality and air pollution. And we are very well aware of outdoor air pollution, and we're aware of some of the devastating effects that can have. But we tend to be less aware of the fact that it actually impacts on us in our indoor environments too. And this becomes very complex because we spend probably 90% of our time indoors, probably at the moment even more than that, because we don't go out very much. And our exposure depends on where we are in the country, the design of our environment, and both what happens outdoors and what happens indoors. And I think I'm probably preaching to the converted in this setting here, because you probably all do know, but the indoor air quality is hugely overlooked, and yet there are hundreds of different sources that sometimes we introduce deliberately. You know, we introduce air fresheners, we introduce our cleaning chemicals, but we don't think about those exposures. And yet we are exposed continuously to pollutants indoors, from pollutants outdoors, and from the exchange between the two. And that leads on to a real world on ventilation. So there's been a very much a focus over the past few months of improve your ventilation, increase your ventilation, but that doesn't work everywhere. If you are in a polluted environment where you've got high levels of pollutions outdoors, simply opening all the windows, it may solve a COVID problem, but it won't. It will then increase an exposure problem to outdoor air pollution. So we know now there's trade-offs between those indoor and outdoor sources. We have to think through what that means for our systems. We know that ventilation in buildings is not just a single number parameter. It is very variable. It's driven by a whole raft of different factors, even whether it's mechanical or naturally driven. We also know that buildings are very highly connected. We have movement within zones and between zones in buildings. We know that people influence it, and the whole system is a complex interaction between the people in the building itself, the pollutants, and the microorganisms, and need to think through this as a whole complex picture. And I want to just give you two very brief examples from research studies that we've worked on. So this is a study called the Refresh study, where we looked at measuring ventilation in buildings and how buildings surrounding your building mattered. So it was a full-scale experimental study with some computational modelling. So the picture on the right shows a cube, which is the building we measured. And it was measured on its own, and then it was surrounded by pseudo buildings made out of hay bales. And if you look at the car, you can see the size of these buildings as an indicator. And we measured this building with windows open and with different orientations. And the pictures on the left show results from computational modelling. And we looked at what happens if you've got the building on its own, and what happens when it's surrounded by others. And I just want you to look at the blue cube in all of the pictures. And the top pictures, when you've got the cube on its own, when the wind is parallel to the windows are parallel to the wind, you don't really see much flow through the building. But when it's perpendicular, which is the lower picture, you see a really strong jet of flow as the wind passes through the building. But go to the right-hand side, when you put that building in an array of cubes, the blue cube looks the same in both. The inside flow looks the same, which tells us that that external environment has changed the flow around that building and has therefore influenced the ventilation rate and the ventilation flow patterns in that building. So really it's just a demonstration that we can't just say, oh, look, I've got a building, open a window. Actually, it's a really complex interaction between all the other buildings and the wind direction and the orientation of everything in that city environment. Very different study is where we said, okay, where do we find microorganisms in homes, and does ventilation affect this? And this, we went into 100 homes in the Glasgow area. We sampled for microorganisms on different surfaces, and we did a survey to look at what people's ventilation behaviour was. And the picture on the left shows that we found quite varying amounts of microorganisms across within the sites in the homes, but the most variable was the top of the door, which is the site which you don't touch, so is most representative of what gets deposited from the air. And we also then said, how does this relate to ventilation? And we looked at a particular class of bacteria called gram-negatives, and they are associated more with human pathogens. And we basically found that people who opened their windows more frequently were less likely to have gram-negative bacteria in their homes. So it sort of suggests that if you keep your building more contained, you've closed it up, you've not got that ventilation, that you're more likely to have these presence of bacteria that could be human pathogens. It's a complex system, this, and I've just talked briefly about the flow, which is probably within this diagram, the blue bits in the middle. So the indoor environment and the flow, the interactions of it. But our indoor environment essentially affects our physical and mental health. It affects our comfort, our performance, our productivity, our sleep. It also affects the energy and carbon use of those buildings. And it's not just the complex flows, which is the physical bit, which is where I spend a lot of my time thinking about, but all of that is influenced by a set of human behavioural, cultural behaviour, education and training, guidance, regulation and standards. So everything that we do in our buildings is influenced by the systems that are in place that have created those buildings and created how we use those buildings, and then that all takes on into the health consequences that come from it. And I wanted to mention inequalities as well, because these impacts are not even at all. We've seen it with COVID, we see it with air quality, and both impact the groups who are the most disadvantaged. And the data on the right is Public Health England data on rates of COVID-19, and you can see that those in the most deprived quintile have far higher rates than those in the least deprived. And that again is a complex set of factors depending on your geographical location, but those who have the least income tend to also have the least stable jobs. They tend to have the jobs that will expose them the most. They tend to live in the housing that is the lowest quality and the most crowded, most likely to have to use some form of shared transport, most likely to have other health conditions that are going to make them more susceptible, and probably also have the lowest levels of education to be able to understand some of these risks. So it is a very difficult, challenging area. We need to make sure that anything we do considers the equality in our society. And I want to finish up, just nearly done. I want to finish up by introducing Breathing City, which is a new research network. We've literally just started, but we want to start tackling some of this enormous challenge and think, how could we redesign ventilation to think much more in a health-facing way? And what would that mean in terms of what we need to know technically through to what we need to innovate, through to where we need changes in regulation, practice and guidance. And I just want to finish up with a thoughts for the future. So we need a change. We need a paradigm shift in our built environment thinking. We need to go to a human-centered design where health outcomes is the metric, not the physical or energy performance of the building. We need to be thinking holistically. We can't just think about the building in isolation. We have to think about how it links between indoors and outdoors and design out those inequalities in our built environments. To do that, we need people working together. It needs an interdisciplinary approach with the architects, engineers, working with behavioural science, working with health sciences in this. I think we need to recognise complexity. We've now got in the public mind, ventilation matters, open a window. We need to go to the next step and say, actually, it's not quite as simple as that. There's a lot more to it. We need to think that through. And we need strategies that tackle existing buildings, not just the new design. And the whole thing of this needs to be embedded right through from policies and how we educate, right from the earliest age of school, how your built environment matters, through how we train those who work in this sector. And we need to add this into our definitions of sustainability more effectively. So I just want to say thank you. And if you are interested in our Breathing City network, please follow us on Twitter. Please get in touch with us, join our mailing list, and we'll invite you to our events. And I will stop at that point. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kath, for a really fascinating presentation. Really enjoyed that. So please put your questions into the Q&A. I see we've got one come in. So I'm just going to ask a quick question and we'll take a few more. So we're very pleased to see this sort of pathway to undoing lockdown. And I'm just sort of wondering, where are your key concerns in that pathway?
So the pathway to lockdown, I think a lot of it from my concern is we don't necessarily always recognise the role that the environment plays in this. And in the summer, it becomes very easy to mitigate. So we can mitigate, it's much easier to go outdoors, it's much easier to open your windows, etc. One of my worries is that we hit problems again once we get into the cold season next year. We get to November and we close up again and we have a problem again.
Well, if we make it through to the winter without a fourth wave, then hallelujah, as far as I'm concerned.
Yes.
Okay, so we've got a couple of questions in the chat. So the first one is from Harry Paticus. So good morning, Harry. So perhaps I can ask Richard to unmute you and we can say welcome and see your smiling face, and we can ask you to ask your question. Is that possible, Richard?
Yeah, Harry's good to go, I think.
Okay.
Hello, can you hear me all right?
We can, thanks, Harry.
Thanks very much, Kath, for that talk. That was really great. So we're architects and we're working on retrofit proposals for primary schools at the moment in London. And with schools returning on the 8th of March in a couple of weeks, there are obviously a lot of class teachers and head teachers who are wondering what should they be doing in terms of managing air quality in classrooms. And most of these classrooms don't have any ventilation systems. They have either single-sided or two-sided opening windows. In some cases, just one opening window in a corner and no other windows anywhere else that open. They'll just be sealed units. Sealed glazed units, and some of them have triple ventilation and some don't. So I'm just wondering, can you recommend anything in terms of air cleaning or any processes that we might share with the teachers?
Yeah, I mean, this is a real challenging one. I mean, I would be tempted, if you can, to get some CO2 measurements while you've got the kids in the class, so you've at least got some idea of the ventilation rates that you've got in there. Those ones that you've described don't sound like they're going to have particularly effective ventilation. So those, I think, are probably classic ones for, well, in an ideal world, I would say install a new ventilation system, but that isn't going to happen quickly. So air cleaning devices are probably the most effective solution in some of those settings, and is going to be, will potentially make some benefits from a wider air quality as well as just COVID. But I think those ones which are tricky, really the only immediate solution is to, unless you can take them out of use, which I think is unlikely, is to use air cleaners, and probably thinking about HEPA as your baseline air cleaners. The reason being is that they are proven technology. They are readily available, unlike some of the other ultraviolet type units, which only the HEPA units will take out particulates as well. And there are various cleaning technologies out there, things like ionizers, which are unproven and may well introduce secondary pollutants which cause even more problems. So I would definitely go with HEPAs.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kath. So you said measure CO2 in the classrooms when the classrooms are in use. What sort of levels do we want to find? What do we not want to find?
This is also a tricky one, because I would love to say that there's a number that was safe, and there isn't, and it varies.
Right.
What I would be saying is, if you've got CO2 that's over 1,500 parts per million, do something about it as quickly as you can. If you're measuring, if you're measuring below 800, you're doing well. If you're measuring somewhere between 800 and 1,500, keep an eye on it. Try and get it down to a lower level. But you know, but just, you know, if you get the odd spike, don't panic, because the odd spike doesn't mean anything. It's the longer duration exposure that matters more.
Yeah. Okay. Really useful. Okay, we've got time for a couple more questions. So up next on my list, I've got Barbara Jones. So good morning, Barbara. Nice to see you here. So perhaps I can ask Richard to unmute you. And
morning, Simon.
Morning, Barbara. How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks.
Great.
Morning, Kath.
Hi.
Great presentation. Thanks very much. I work with the Architects Straw Works, and we build very principally only with natural materials. So we have breathable wall systems all the time. And I wondered if you know of any research that that shows if there's any difference in indoor air quality between breathable wall systems and the more common modern wall systems that don't breathe.
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't know very much about breathable wall systems, so I can't really comment on the research on that. I think it would be definitely an interesting area to look at, and I'd be interested to see what it does to humidity as well as pollutants in the environment. But I don't know any details on that at the moment, I'm afraid.
Well, they do definitely reduce condensation and mold, and increase the feelings of well-being inside the house.
So maybe that's a good thing. I think it'd be interesting to get some more data to see what the environments are doing.
Thank you.
What I would do is sign up to Breathing Cities, and there's quite a sort of evolving network there, and there's a possibility of maybe looking at some basic research, that type of thing. So, all right. So thank you. I've got time for one more question. I think there's a few more in there, but Kath is going to spend a little bit of time before she needs to go answering those. So I've got Lucy Pedler next. So morning, Lucy. So thanks ever so much for your question, and thanks for attending this morning. So I'm hoping that we have unmuted you and we can hear you.
Thank you, Simon. Kath, we run a lot of events at the Green Register on ventilation, and it's quite shocking how the majority of ventilation systems in the UK fail on one level or another due to basically poor installation and bad workmanship. From that baseline, our concern is that with the increase in COVID being carried through ventilation systems, if we're starting from a ventilation system that hasn't been adequately installed, we're sort of hiding to nowhere. Have you seen any work that is going to address this so that we have more robust, monitored yeah, a monitored system in ventilation systems to minimize this problem?
So I haven't seen any work. I agree. I think we need better. We do need to understand our systems better, and we need to, you know, I think there's a big issue with compliance and the fact that there are many, many buildings that don't meet building regulations and or drift from them. I think from an immediate perspective with COVID, particularly in large buildings, the recirculating HVAC systems concern me less than the risks within a particular space. The reason being is we haven't seen much evidence that there's wide scale transmission through HVAC systems in buildings. It does seem that a lot of where there is airborne transmission, it's quite local to, you know, within the same room. Unlike, for example, something like measles, which can go, you know, all the way down the corridor and around the building. That's not to say it couldn't, and we should definitely be looking at that as a principle for, you know, just better building performance generally. But my biggest concern at the moment is the fresh air flow rates to so many spaces that are hugely underventilated, and you know, think of just about, you know, half the retail environments we go in, you walk into a small shop and there is no ventilation other than the fact that you open the door on a regular basis. Those are the ones which concern me the most at the moment.
Okay, thank you so much. We're thoroughly indebted to you, Kath, for giving up your time so generously this morning. So thank you once again. There's a couple of questions in the Q&A. So Kath has generously said she'll hang on until about 11. So keep your questions coming in there. So she's happy to answer those. And we'll share all the slides and the recording and the Q&A recording with everybody as well after the event. So it's a good record that way. So a huge round of applause from everybody in the room. Thank you very much, Kath. So I'd now like to introduce Jeff Smith. So Jeff's an indoor air quality expert. He's in Switzerland. So that's the joy of these events, is that we can just buzz him in. And so if you share your slides, Jeff, and get your slides up, so Jeff has done a lot of work with Rosamund Kisser-Deborah, who's speaking this afternoon. He's also done a lot of work in India and looking at pollution and indoor air quality in India. And he's a consultant to the World Health Organization. So thanks, Jeff. So over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Simon. And I'd like to thank the Alliance for Sustainable Building Products for inviting me this year. Really excited to have the opportunity. I just want to go ahead and jump right into it. I have a lot of slides and haven't much time, but I was ambitious and wanted to cover several topics altogether. But some of the things that slides I have, Professor Noakes has already spoken about, so I will go through those quite quickly. But something that I feel strongly about, especially in light of the pandemic, is I like to echo the same message, and I share frequently that what we recognize from this pandemic is that it's shown a light on our built environment and on, you know, the energy, the materials, and the processes that we have available. And these are choices, and these choices by and large are provided to us by our national and city governments through regulation. And you know, but science, the good news is that science has the solutions, but the impact to our choices of energy, materials, and processes, right, is that currently environmental health risks, and this includes air pollution, water pollution, foodborne pollution, contamination, is up about 12.6 million deaths. That's also an older number, hasn't been updated in a couple of years, but roughly it's still the same. About 1 in 4 deaths around the world every day are due to these choices. So we have solutions, and there are roadmaps to those solutions, and that's what you know, the presentation and why we're here today and talking. So one of the topics that I wanted to emphasize and promise to share to Simon was sensing health and safety indoors. So I have some insights and multiple benefits that I wanted to go over. So when I've been involved with projects where we've done 24/7, 365 days a year, auditing of building spaces. And what I can say is that this will allow us to correlate the environmental and pollution data, both outdoors and indoors, because for things like filtration efficiency, you need to know what the outdoor particulate pollution levels are, as well as those indoors. But we can take that and combine health data, and we'll know when our actions are working or not. And so unless we start collecting this data, we won't know. But there are multiple benefits for collecting that other than just helping researchers. So filtration that it can capture these particulates, as Catherine had mentioned, and ventilation has multiple benefits too. These same filters that are in place in some spaces and not in other spaces, though, are able to capture viruses, even small viruses, because they're not riding naked. They're in respiratory droplets and airborne aerosols as well. So what can you do with these sensors? You can know that your investment is working when you make these improvements. And so this is one mechanism of being able to show that the multiple benefits are going to improve when you increase your ventilation and when you have adequate filtration. And these are by and large health and safety, as well as energy savings for the longest time in the indoor space. I think we were focusing a lot on energy savings, and then there was, the CO2 that's generated. But when we look at air pollution, and we know that there are these other benefits, and I'll cover these. And one thing I wanted to mention is that when you do deploy sensors and monitors in your indoor spaces, it would behoove you to join some of these networks, as was described earlier. And because your data, the ambient, you have to at least put 1 or 2 ambient monitors out at, let's say, at a campus or facility, again, to know your filtration efficiency. And this data will help inform citizen science networks and researchers and city managers as well. And so I'm a big advocate of open data and citizen science. So I always like to mention that here. And so what can they do with that? Well, as I mentioned earlier, it improves health, but researchers can detect and correlate the ambient and household air. But imagine that they're able to then take the hospitalization rates, not just due to COVID, but even after COVID, something that is described by WHO and others a lot these days is build back better. So if we're going to build back better, we should be able to do it in an intelligent way. We certainly, I served many years in the US Army Reserves. We certainly can begin investing. If we can see anything, we should be investing more or as much as we invest in national security for our national defense. We should be investing in health and safety. There is no sustainability without health and safety. So if we take some of that health data and we're able to then overlay it onto open tools, like this is MIT open source code here. And let's say that you're able to then overlay the hospitalization rates of children 5 years and younger, 8 years and younger for respiratory illnesses, and you'd be able to do that. So when you deploy those low-cost sensors, you'll be able to eventually put that data into systems like this and others where this data can be integrated and overlaid. And now imagine a city manager is able to see that, hey, where the waste to energy plume is, we see higher infant hospitalization rates and so on, heart attacks and whatnot. So back to indoor air quality and the multiple benefits. We have another speaker who's going to be speaking on the Well Building Institute standards. So I'll just cover this real quickly. But there are, in addition to ventilation benefits for reducing the potential for contagions in the air, there's also the benefits of improving the cognition. So students perform better, workers perform better. There was a Lawrence Berkeley National Lab study in 2012, and Harvard duplicated it in 2016. And they found that in 6 of 9 metrics of performance for reasoning skills and cognitive decision-making skills, that people were performing less than 50%, beginning as low as 600 parts per million. And for this reason, in recent years, the International Well Building Institute standards that they recommend is 800 parts per million for CO2. If we do that standard, which preceded COVID-19 by years, it would also reduce significantly the risk of rebreathing and sharing air with others in the space and becoming sick, not just with COVID, but with any other type of illness. What else? Well, how do we know this? Well, the US Department of Education and US EPA had done studies, and just going quickly here, one study found that children in classrooms with higher outdoor air ventilation rates would score 14 to 15% higher on standardized tests. So that would be like a IGCSE or the SAT, as it is called in the United States. So imagine that just having better ventilated, more oxygen, less CO2 in that indoor space, the students are performing better. And in the Harvard study, one thing they pointed out is that they also found that workers were doing improved productivity as well. And so that was part of that recommendation. Catherine covered COVID a little bit, but just, you know, there are droplets that are, and aerosols that are short range and long range, and indoors they can accumulate. And this, by improving ventilation and filtration, we reduce the risk. There's the International Well Building Institute and RAVA. They have guidance out there for COVID. You can pause the video later and get these URLs and have a look at those. I've been sharing International Labor Organization guidance and some of my own guidance that I had developed last year. So basically, the text you see there in green, I'm recommending 24/7 monitoring of ventilation and humidity rates, humidity especially because for me and what other researchers and what we've seen is that at 50%, the virus is not so dry that it becomes always aerosolized and then even resuspended in a space, but it also keeps it at a size level that the salts and proteins that are in the respiratory fluid itself can lead to some of the rapid destruction of the SARS-CoV-2 virus itself. So what else? Monitors can alert the staff when indoor CO2 begins to reach and exceed levels, right? And so when you deploy these monitors, you need to have some sort of dashboard or other mechanism. But the benefit here is that your return on investment is performance of the workers, performance of the students. 14 to 15% on standardized tests is quite gobsmacking data. And we have decades of data that have associated increased levels of VOCs, increased levels of other contaminants and volatiles, PAHs within indoors, depending on their location. And so every space is different. So what is it best to do? When I've gone in audited buildings, it's been better to see what's happening in real time and not rely on what people are putting onto a clipboard, for example.
2 minutes, Jeff, please.
2 minutes? Okay.
2 minutes, yeah, thank you. I'm sorry,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, all right. So, so let's go ahead and skip ahead here. So the benefits and what the data has shown is that there's reduced absenteeism, but buildings in Asia, as these improvements have been made, they found that they're retaining staff and they're retaining higher footfall. They're retaining, if it's a large building with multiple leaseholders and businesses, they're retaining more leaseholders because people begin sharing this data on apps, and they're even picking, let's say, coffee shops based on the data that they're sharing with each other. This coffee shop has cleaner air because they are using filtration. And so the other part of this is that that I wanted to mention was that when you go around and with these devices, you don't have to rely on manual audits. You'll start to detect higher rates of pollution due to, in this case, a door fell off a TFA. You have people who are not replacing the doors of TFAs, treated fresh air units on rooftops, as they should, and you can even see that leak in highly polluted environments. And then there's the energy savings as well, which oftentimes pays for the systems completely and entirely, because now you are starting to turn things on and off as needed. So the natural ventilation that I wanted to, that I had promised to mention, is that, as Catherine had said, in hospitals that were designed, windows were designed opposite of each other. This creates a natural cross ventilation. That's what's required for that. We can't all live in hotels outdoors. We need to use, it's common here in Switzerland, very especially, we have these rooftop and types of in-roof ventilation ceilings. There's a couple there that I had in my home, in another home. Currently, I have to open windows, as you see in the bottom left, and that's my daughter's school in the bottom right. And so the thing I wanted to mention that is that there are some environments where there's heavy pollution that you're not able to rely on natural ventilation alone. So the sustainable building design of one geographical location versus another will be different. In this case, a wildfire, many areas in California and Australia and then the heavily polluted nations, people are exposed to all sorts of levels of pollution due to wildfires and local pollution sources. So you've got to have, be considering mechanical ventilation and filtration in many of these types of scenarios. Under health and safety for all, I don't think I have time to present those slides if I'm at.
No, I'm so sorry, Jeff, but we're going to have to wrap it up, really.
Okay.
So, I'm so sorry to do that to you, but we're short on time, and I don't want to run behind on time. So, please pop your questions in the Q&A to Jeff. And perhaps I can ask you, Jeff, to keep an eye on the Q&A, and if you can answer those questions as they come in. And now I'm going to move on to Ben. So good morning. So Ben Channon is director at EKIST Advisory, and he's a well-mined advisory. And Ben is going to have 15 minutes with us to talk to us about his experiences and products and their effects on health and general mental well-being. So thanks, and over to you, Ben.
Great, thanks very much, Simon. Just to check, can you all see my screen?
We can, thank you, yeah.
Perfect, fantastic. Well, firstly, thank you so much to ASBP for having me. It's fantastic to be here today, to be able to speak to you guys all about air quality and designing healthier buildings and what we do at EKIST too. Just a little bit of background about EKIST and what we do, because you may not have heard of us, and you may not even have heard of the role that we do because it's quite unique. But we are effectively a design for wellbeing consultancy. So we work with architects, with clients to and design teams to help them to produce healthier buildings, which really support better quality of life, inspire people, and adapt to suit people's needs as their lives change and evolve. And as it says here, we're really passionate about this subject. We're always messaging each other new reports and bits of data at the weekends. It really is something we're all very excited about. And really important to say that it's completely, everything we look at and do is completely supported by scientific research. And I think that's something that's really come across in what Kath and Jeff have been saying this morning, that we have a huge amount of data behind healthy buildings now and what makes a healthy building. And some of that comes from WELL. As Simon mentioned, I'm involved with the WELL Mind feature concept, helping advise on that. But we do a lot of WELL certification here at EKIST, and we also use scientific evidence from universities and institutions around the world. So everything we do is very robustly supported, and we believe that's really important. So when we are thinking about designing healthy buildings, these are a list of just some of the things that we think about. You can see air quality at the top of the list there. But designing a healthy building has to be looked at holistically. We can't take any one element in isolation. So it's also really important that we think about things like the quality of the water that's coming into a building. People are obviously drinking that, and we may take it for granted that, particularly in the UK, that it's healthy enough to drink, but actually there's often lots of variations in water quality around the country. Things like lighting design, both natural and artificial light, and how that's affecting people's circadian rhythms and their natural health. The acoustics of a space, that's really important, and the World Health Organization actually has highlighted that as a major issue. They believe environmental noise is a big issue. The materials we use within buildings, and that's something I'll come on to talk about in a minute, both in terms of their mental health benefits, but their impact on health, air quality too. How we lay out a building, biophilic design, how we bring nature into a building, and also how we operate and run a building, which is something else I'll touch on in a minute. This can have a big impact on the health of people using those spaces. And finally, thinking about it on a master plan scale as well. Obviously, with air quality, that's really important because it affects how people get around, whether people drive or cycle or walk, and it can have big impacts on the overall feel of a space or of a neighbourhood, and people's mental health there too. So I won't spend too long on this slide because between them, Kath and Jeff have really covered this well. But needless to say, a huge number of deaths globally as a result of poor air quality, unfortunately still. And it's worth saying, Kath pointed out that COVID has to date sadly killed 2.4 million people. When we look at that figure, 8.7 million deaths globally just from burning fossil fuels, the impact on poor air quality. And yet that's not getting anywhere near the sort of airtime, screen time that COVID is. And it's something we're not talking about enough. It's a problem that is quite easily solvable in a lot of ways. We could address it in many, many ways, both through behavioural changes and policy changes. So I believe it's something that really should be higher on the agenda than it currently is. And as I said, I won't go into the stats too much, but large proportion of global deaths, particularly as well, tragically amongst young people. And with more and more people moving into cities, we're now seeing that an even greater number of people are living in places where air quality is just simply not good enough. However, outdoor air pollution is only part of the issue, and I'm really pleased actually that both Kath and Jeff have touched upon the importance of indoor air quality, because quite often I think it's easy for people to get caught up in the conversation of cars and factories and burning coal. Of course, that plays a massive role, but indoor air quality too causes a huge number of deaths every single year, linked to lots of health conditions, pneumonia, lung disease, cancers, heart disease. And it can, as an asthma sufferer myself, it's something that I feel quite strongly about. It can aggravate a lot of chronic conditions, which not only then affect our physical health, but can really affect how we feel psychologically if people are struggling with those conditions every single day. And the reason that this is so important is that even before COVID happened, we were spending almost all of our time indoors anyway, 90% according to most estimates. So the indoor environment really is having a big impact on us most of the time. And it's also worth saying that within the last 50 years or so, we've obviously pushed to create more airtight buildings to target sustainability. And as Jeff said, of course, sustainability is hugely important. We're fighting what sometimes feels like a losing battle to save the planet at the moment, and we have to address those issues. But it should not come at the cost or the expense of human health. And one of the concerns I have is that as buildings become more and more airtight, we're not getting those ventilation rates we need. It does increase the risk of things like condensation and mold as well. So I'm aware of time, so I'm just going to touch quickly upon some key issues around indoor air quality. One of the first really important ones is particulate matter. This is also a problem externally, but effectively PM2.5s and PM10s are fine particles. They can get into our lungs, and smaller particles can get into our bloodstream and our organs too. And some of the main sources of this are things like cooking indoors, if we use things like log burners to heat our homes, and even burning candles can release particulate matter. It's worth saying that means it's a bigger problem in the developing world, where a lot more people rely, say, on open fires to cook than we do here, say, in the UK. But it still is a problem here in the UK and the US and so on. So these processes can also emit other pollutants, things like carbon monoxide and nitrogen dioxide, which, as we know, are very harmful too. So it's really important that we address these issues. Short term, it can cause irritation, it can make us feel unpleasant in the moment, but longer term exposure can be really damaging. It can cause problems like heart and lung disease and cancers. VOCs is an issue that's perhaps talked about a little bit less, but it's really, really important. So basically everything we put in our buildings, to some extent, it will probably give off something into the air once we put it in a building. But some things that we put in, for example, sealants, paints, some furnitures, because they contain a lot of wood glues, for example, can release these VOCs over a period of months, weeks, months, or even years. So effectively, you might buy a nice new sofa, put it in your living room, and then for quite a long period of time, it's giving off pretty nasty chemicals into your home, which you and your family are then breathing in. And again, there's short-term impacts that this can have, things like headaches and even sort of visual impairments, memory impairments. But longer term, it can have some really significant issues. Again, things like asthma, poor respiratory health, but even damage to our kidneys, livers, central nervous systems. So something we need to be really, really aware of when we're specifying materials or selecting furniture to go in buildings. Carbon dioxide is also one that's been touched upon, so I won't dwell on it for too long. Obviously caused by ourselves and animals. We breathe in oxygen, breathe out carbon dioxide. But it's worth noting that the levels of CO2 inside occupied spaces are usually much, much higher than they would be outdoors. And this causes a number of problems. It's closely linked to sick building syndrome symptoms. So that's the symptoms that people get often when they're in an unhealthy building, often kind of like flu-y, coldy symptoms, problems with breathing and things. But it's really interesting to note that when CO2 levels get quite high, they don't even need to get that high, but it can start to impair our cognitive function, even kind of to the point where we would our responses would be similar to if we were over the legal drinking limit to drive. So it really can have an impact on how we feel in the moment, but then longer term, again, it can have some serious impacts on even things like our organs and our bones. Important too for us to mention humidity, which effectively is how much water vapor is in the air. And this can be caused just by us living our lives, really, by us breathing, doing things like washing, cooking. And it's important to note that too low a humidity, anything below 30%, can be problematic. But also anything too high, once we start going above 60%, it can not only significantly affect our mood, it can make us sleepy, but it can aggravate allergies, respiratory diseases, and obviously result in some of those issues I was mentioning earlier about condensation and damp, which have their own problems that they can cause. And interestingly, as humidity levels rise, the levels of VOCs that get released goes up as well. So we're kind of exacerbating that problem there when the humidity gets too high indoors. So what are some of the simple steps that we can take to improve that? These are some of the strategies that we implement at Echist, either through often the WELL standard, but often through just bespoke design advice as well. So when it comes to materials, one of the key things is that we do specify those low or no VOC products, things that aren't going to be putting lots of harmful chemicals into the air, and knowing what those key risk products are likely to be. So that might be the wood glues in your furniture. It might be the sealants that you use on timber or on a work surface. It could be insulation products and flooring as well. Vinyl floorings can often be quite a big culprit. It's important too that we actually make sure we're choosing products that we know what's going into them. They've got a transparent ingredients list, often they call it, and also that the supply chain, we can kind of verify where everything comes from, that it's reputable, and also from just a moral and ethical point of view that no one's being harmed or taken advantage of in that supply chain. Completely a separate issue from air quality, of course.
2 minutes, Ben. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, nearly there. Someone also mentioned things like breathable skins, and it's worth noting when we look at certain materials like clays, they can help to actually maintain a healthy humidity by absorbing or releasing moisture from the air. And these natural materials too can offer benefits to our mental health. So that's something that's worth considering. Lots of data out there now showing that timber, for example, makes us more relaxed, lowers our heart rate. And someone earlier asked a question about breathable wall buildups. Really important that we do allow condensation and moisture to get out through our wall buildups, because otherwise we can get that condensation and mold in those walls, which is really bad for us. Really important that we ventilate spaces properly too, something that Jeff touched upon, but we can do it artificially or naturally. But we would recommend, if you're using artificial systems, that of course you're using the right kind of filters to combat things like VOCs and the particulate matter. We've got to clean those before we install them in buildings, because otherwise you get lots of construction pollution material in those ventilation systems. And when you turn them on, they just blow particles everywhere. And as Kath has already talked about, things like HEPA filters, UV air treatments are ways that we can look at minimizing the impact of kind of microbes and viruses too. Really important that we measure these. I'm very aware I'm about to run out of time, so I'll be quick, but we've got to be aware of what the problems are. If we don't measure, then it's very difficult for us to actually understand what we need to improve. And there's products here like this Air Tracker by Plume Labs, and also systems like Air Rated, which really look to measure that sort of data, feed it back to people using space too. So it gives them a sense of control and understanding of their environment, which is really important. And finally, just wanted to touch upon operations, how we run and manage a building. So things like air fresheners have already been mentioned, but the cleaning products that we use in a building are really important to be aware of. There's no point us designing a really healthy building and then people coming in and using lots of quite nasty cleaning chemicals or pesticides, things like that. But at the same time, it is very important that we do clean our buildings regularly to stop buildup of things like dust and microorganisms. We obviously try and push for non-smoking policies where we can, because of the impacts that can have, not just on the smoker, but on people around them. And then it's about also reviewing those combustion-based appliances, things like open fires, stoves, space heaters. We generally recommend you move towards electric cooking devices where possible now, because not only is that going to improve indoor air quality, but actually the grid is now getting cleaner year on year, meaning that it's a more sustainable choice too. So sorry, that was a very quick whistle-stop tour. I'm aware we're tight on time, but I just wanted to say thank you so much again for having me, guys. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I hope that was of interest.
Really fascinating. Thank you so much, Ben. We really enjoyed that. So there's a couple of questions in the chat. So perhaps I can ask you to keep an eye on that and respond there. So we're going to have a break now. So we're going to start back promptly at 11:30. We're just going to do a bit of AV check with our next speakers. So thanks very much to Catherine, Jeffrey and Ben for fantastic presentations so far. So we're going to continue promptly at 11:30. So perhaps if you want to just stand up, have a walk around, stretch your legs, make a cup of tea, grab a banana, and we'll see you back here at 11:30. So thank you very much. Run out of time, which I don't want to do. So I'm hoping that the audience is gradually making their way back, and they've stretched their legs. So it's now 11:30. So welcome back, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our next session. And our first speaker in this session is Geraint Davis MP, who's a member for Parliament for Swansea West. And Geraint chairs the all-party parliamentary group on air pollution, and also put forward a plastics bill. So we've got 20 minutes with Geraint. So put your questions in the Q&A, and over to you, Geraint.
Right, thank you so much for that kind introduction. My name is Geraint Davis, as just been said. I'm the chair of the all-party group on air pollution. And obviously people will probably know in this audience that something like 64,000 people die per year in Britain alone prematurely from air pollution. 7 million is the global figure. And obviously as we approach COP26, we need to think both about, how our contribution towards climate change is can be affected properly, and how that impacts as well with air pollution and how the two join up. So today's conference is obviously about healthy buildings, and I've been involved with that, Gary Newman and others, talking about the issue of the importance of actually switching over to wood from concrete in order that we get carbon sequestration and a healthier environment and less climate change. But in terms of air quality itself and human health, it's important when we're looking inside rather than out, because obviously most of the focus is outside, about all the pollutants we are inhaling. And even prior to the pandemic, we had a situation where 90% of the time we were spending indoors. So it's more critical than ever after the pandemic, as people are now switching their lifestyles, I think on a permanent basis towards a greater proportion of time working at home, that we have healthy buildings and healthy environments to actually stem the growth of some of these problems. As I said, and as people will know, the focus has been on outdoor air, and the Clean Air Bill I put forward very much looked at sort of diesel pollution in urban environments. And I think Rosamond, it's fantastic to have us here today with us, will be talking about that, the issues of asthma and the issues of controlling outdoor air pollution. And people will be aware that there's been a campaign for some time now for a Clean Air Bill. And Rosamond talked about Ella's Law as well. And there's an opportunity that we face in the Environment Bill, which is at the first of 2 days. The second day will be carried over after the Queen's speech, to introduce World Health Organization air quality standards in all, and specifically 10 micrograms, per cubic meter by 2030 outside, and also a campaign to ensure that air pollution inside is included in the Environment Bill. Because up till now, this has actually been changed, but up till very recently, the natural environment was simply defined as out of doors, and at the time we spend most of the time indoors, it's a bit farcical. So there's been a lot of focus on outside, what we can do in terms of electric cars and the like, in terms of more sustainable transport, a planning system and an economic system that means we can work from home and travel less, and indeed have healthier walks and runs and cycles to school. But it's important, as we are today, to look indoors at some of the problems. People in this room will probably be aware of the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health issued a report on indoor air pollution last January. They focused on the fact that many of you will be familiar with, that increasingly we are living in homes which has got double or triple glazing, not enough ventilation, sometimes damp, withheld cooking smells, and an increasing number of toxic chemicals in the things that we clean our furnishing with, the sprays we put on ourselves, and indeed candles and the like. I mean, there's nothing less romantic than a candlelit dinner for two with closed windows, unless you want to kill each other. It's also the case that you'll be talking in this particular group about volatile organic compounds. There's also an issue, of course, with fire retardants. People may know that there's so I think it's 7 or 8 kilos of fire retardant in the average home. It's double what it would be in the United States or the EU, because the tests on fire retardants here are much greater. There's literally a flame test in Britain, so you can actually apply a lighter to a sofa and it won't catch fire. But elsewhere it's a smolder test, which would mean that if you left a cigarette butt on your sofa, it wouldn't catch fire. And what this means is that over time, these chemicals get into the air, get into your skin. And actually, when there is a fire, given that most people die from smoke and not from fire itself, the smoke itself becomes much more toxic. And this is one of the contributory factors to the Grenfell deaths, tragic and avoidable deaths as well. So on Monday, of course, Boris Johnson spoke about coming out of COVID. The all-party group has done a strategy on coming out of COVID about last June, in fact, basically saying that given that there's a link between coronavirus and air pollution, namely the Harvard found that 1 microgram of extra PM2.5 in the air, in other words, in more air polluted areas, gave rise to an 8% rise in COVID death. That figure was up to about 14–15% when it was looked at in the Max Planck Institute in Germany. It's clear that there are relationships between sort of poor air quality, air pollution, and COVID infection and COVID death. And so it reminds us, given that so many people are dying in any case from air pollution, that looking to the future in terms of building back better, building back greener, we need to look at a clean air bill that does have, as I'm calling for in the Environment Bill, enforceable and legally binding targets for PM2.5, but also other gases, various particulates and various nitrogen oxides in particular, but also have a view towards how we should be improving our indoor air quality. And with that in mind, partly that in mind, at least, another amendment that I put forward on behalf of the all-party group was that there should be an annual report underlining and recording a duty on all government departments to deliver air quality and to list what actions they'd actually taken. Because one of the problems DEFRA has got in moving forward and why they've resisted, both myself and indeed me and Rosamond when we saw George Eustace a couple of weeks ago, was clearly DEFRA, the department itself, hasn't got the levers to actually control air quality, because they don't control local governments, incidentally, they've thrown the hot potato to, and local government, of course, doesn't control local motorways near to urban centres, and doesn't control the Treasury, who decide what the diesel duties are, or what the scrappage scheme is, or what the investment and rollout phasing of electric power points is. So clearly we do need an integrated approach, which includes local government planning, local government zoning, local government action, as well as, whether it's building motorways, providing incentives for sustainable transport, providing absolute limits for air quality, or whatever, so that we can all work together for a better air quality. So this conference is particularly important because I've got to say, it's important for me that we try and ensure that in COP26 that we have not just climate change, but air pollution, and also, of course, the built environment as a contributor both towards mitigating climate change, but in order to provide a healthy environment. And that means less fossil fuels, more ventilation, less damp, and planning for a future that's healthy and both healthy and sustainable. And I know that would include using more wood and sustainable products in our construction, and thinking also, as the Chair's just mentioned, about things like plastics. This is slightly off brief, but in terms of air quality, of course, there's an increasing an unknown risk of inhaling microplastics. Obviously, people who live in cramped conditions with, washing machines and the like, which may be pushing out air that's drying clothes that have been made to a large extent from plastic for cheapness, are again perhaps at risk. And I certainly believe it's important that we do put a tax on virgin plastic to make sustainable alternatives, natural alternatives, more affordable, in particular at a time, of course, that by 2050, half the fish, there'll be as much plastic in the sea as fish. Where we are in the sort of timetable of events, as I've mentioned, is that the Environment Bill will be coming back after the Easter, after the next Queen's speech, which is in May, is thought to be in May. And there will be an opportunity for Lord's amendments to come forward. And I would ask and suggest that people in this audience themselves, and ask other people to write to their MPs to suggest that we do include World Health Organization standards as binding legally enforceable air quality limits, that we do suggest that there's an all government duty to improve air quality, and that would then kick in obviously to requirements for both planning and building regulations, because we'll know again in this room as well, building regulations is focused very firmly on heat insulation, which we can understand. There's a difficult balance with ventilation that's certainly been brought forward with the issues around coronavirus. Coronavirus, incidentally, is obviously as being an appalling episode, But some of the things that have been sort of belatedly learnt about this have been that, given that it's an aerosol virus, namely it's transmitted through the air, and it's much, much worse if people are talking, for instance, if they're in call centres and throwing their voice and therefore vapor, which contains this virus. There's been more of a focus on social distancing, surface cleansing, and ventilation. And these things we should bear in mind moving forward in terms of managing the built environment, in particular, of course, in schools where young people are. So simple things like ensuring the cleaning is done the night before, not the morning of the lesson, because otherwise the chemicals are in the room, the windows are closed on a cold day. It's important to ventilate those classrooms, not just for coronavirus, but moving forward into the future. So, you know, obviously this has been an awful episode, and climate change is moving forward rapidly. We can't avert climate change, as David Attenborough has told us. All we can do is to try and reduce the rate of increase and eventually bring it to a halt at a higher temperature level, where we will still have sustained climatic problems affecting us. So I think in conclusion then, we have a window of opportunity to change the law to improve it, as I was mentioning in the Environment Bill. I would encourage people to write to their MPs, in particular to Conservative MPs. I'm a Labour MP, and the Conservatives have got an 80 majority. So the only way to change the law is if 40 Conservatives vote for amendment, which the government isn't necessarily pushing forward with the greatest enthusiasm. The government's current plan is to have air quality targets set by 2022 that aren't enforceable, that can be changed by the Secretary of State. And frankly, that isn't a regulatory framework that focuses the mind of industry and the public sector and the third sector to deliver the outcomes that we all want to see for all our families. So write to your MPs, in particular the Conservatives, say when the Environment Bill comes back, you want to see World Health Organization air quality standards in them, and you want to ensure there's a duty in all departments to work hard to get air quality improved, including indoors, both in our homes and finally in our work, where millions of days are lost. And if there's any businesses out there, don't forget this is a profit opportunity to improve your workers' health, so they'll be there happily more often and working harder as well, because it's just a tragic loss of life and work and productivity from unclean air. I'll leave it there, Simon. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much, Geraint. You covered an incredible amount of ground in a short space of time, so congratulations. One breath. Yes, I was going to say, you must be very good at the didgeridoo. Circular breathing is clearly something you're just a natural at. So interestingly, we have a few members who are experts at measuring and monitoring in our membership. And one of them is based in Wales. It's called PPM Limited. So they're based up in Anglesey. And they did some monitoring for us at our Healthy Buildings Expo at University College London a couple of years ago. And we set it up in the morning and let it run all through the day. And then they presented in the afternoon. And what was really interesting was that the VOC levels were massively high right at the beginning of the morning. And that was basically the cleaning regime that University College London, worked with. And then as the day carried on, you could just see that, you could see the VOC levels just dipping away. So it's crucial really that we get better at measuring and monitoring. So I think measuring and monitoring for traffic pollution is quite a complex area and something perhaps we need to do a bit more on. And may I mention, Chair, I know we've got just a couple of minutes before we go to Rosamond, on the point you just made. It is massively important that we do monitoring outside our schools, in our workplaces, because what this issue is about is public sentiment. Because if MPs and lawmakers, have letters going saying, I'm worried about my children at school, I'm worried about outside my school, we've monitored it and there's too many people idling and the local authority needs to stop people idling or parking. Inside my workplace isn't safe, and if that's required, and the union rep says this, then there will be a campaign, there will be an awareness, and there will be change for all our goods.
Excellent. Yes, thank you. Okay, so we've had a comment in the Q&A from an old colleague of mine, Brian Murphy. So Brian has suggested that we should run up a quick campaign template that you can simply download and sign and send to your MP. So that's an excellent suggestion. Thank you for that, Brian. We'll do that. We'll do that this afternoon, and we'll have it up on our website so that you can simply download it. So we'll look back at your recording and pop that into a simple letter that you can then download and send to your MP. So thank you very much. So just to be clear, Geraint, why was your amendment to the Environment Bill thrown out? So the World Health Organization limits, was it really that there's a lack of data and a lack of evidence backing up the WHO levels? Was that really genuinely the response?
So what they're saying, what's being said is, we need to look at get more data, and now know exactly the journey we need to go on to get to the objective. But as you know, anybody setting off on a journey, normally you've got to start the journey with a target to get there.
Right.
And we in industry and in government have to work out the difficulties on the way. I think, that there's an abundance of data, of course, that links, PM 2.5, other particulates, other air quality problems, with a whole host of health problems, which essentially age people. So, as you'll know, it attacks in particular your heart, your brain, and your lungs, and affects unborn children and old people with dementia. Affects young children with anxiety, as I say, gives rise to strokes and the like. So we know how bad it is, and we know what we need to do. And I think there is a concern that industry might not be able to move quickly enough to get rid of some of the higher levels in some of the more difficult places. We'll be hearing from Rosamond in a moment, but the important thing is that level does bite where the worst pollution is. It is conceivable to give a sort of concession, if you like, that in certain industrial environments within a certain perimeter, it might be difficult. Okay. And just talking locally for a moment, I certainly wouldn't want to see the closure of the local Port Talbot Steelworks, for example. Exactly. And that's all got to be factored in.
Right. Okay. But that's all quite manageable, I would humbly suggest. Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time. So please, audience, keep your questions coming in. So Geraint's are you going to be able to hang around, Geraint, or do you need to go? You're on mute now.
I might be able to come in a little later. I'll sort of come in and out and sort of
okay, lovely.
I'll go to mute now anyway, but I may be that later, and I may be able to help with the template as well.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, thank you. So we're going to move on now to Rosamond. So I've spoken to Rosamond on a few occasions now, and she's a uplifting and humbling lady. And so I'm pleased that we've got 20 minutes for her to share a little bit her time and her experiences. And we have made a donation to the Ella Rosamond Kissy Deborah Fund. And we would ask you to try and all do the same too, because it's a very good cause. So Rosamond, over to you, and thank you very much for joining us this morning, and welcome. And so I'll hand over the virtual microphone to you and ask you to set off.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me, Simon. Could I just start off by clarifying, there is no Rosamond Fund, by the way. It's the Ella Roberta Family Foundation.
Sorry,
I think I better start off making that incredibly clear.
Yeah, it's up on our website, so thank you.
There is absolutely no fund for me. I'm not asking anyone to.
Right, thank you for clearing that up.
Indeed.
Apologies.
I want to start off about yesterday, actually. Yesterday, for the first time in quite a long while, I joined respiratory consultants all over London, and it's called, the organisation is the Healthy London Partnership. And our aim is ultimately so no children will die from asthma. In London, 250,000 children have asthma, and every year between 8 and 12 children die from asthma. And my concern at the moment is that figure, which has been steady, is terrible actually to think of 12 children dying, but I'm also concerned that that number is going to go up. I think it's very important. I think my starting point for today, listening to Kathy Noakes, would be to talk about the conversation which I had almost a year ago now. I got a phone call from a doctor, and I think it's best to leave the doctor's name out of it. But she wanted my point of view on a situation in her hospital. And she rang me up and she said, oh, there's a situation in hospital. And we were just talking about Ella, actually. And we wondered what you thought about what is happening in our hospital at the moment. So I said, go ahead, shoot, tell me what's going on. So what she said to me is, if I said to you, there are hundreds and potentially there could be thousands of people coming into hospital that have very similar symptoms to your late daughter, what would you say to me? And I remember at the time saying to her, you are kidding, aren't you? And she said, no, we just wondered what your opinion was. And I remember saying to her, there is no way on this planet, no offense to all of you amazing doctors, but there is no way you are ever going to be able to cope. If they are as ill as my daughter and they have similar symptoms, although not all of them, I can't see how you're going to manage. And that is the link between COVID and my late daughter. So that's the ending of the story, which was last March. And it's been almost a year and we can see what has happened. I just wanted to give you some context about my daughter's illness and how we came to the landmark victory that we did. So we live in Lewisham. I've lived here for coming up to 20 years next month, and all my children were born here. And it's really important to say that when Ella was born, I have to keep on saying this because people still keep on saying to me, are you sure there was no hint of asthma or anything to start off with? I think the easiest thing to say to people is when you look at Ella's GP records from the beginning, there is no indication whatsoever about what was to come. She wasn't a sickly child. She was hardly in hospital, apart from the, hardly in the GP surgery, apart from getting the normal routine jabs. So I can't even say to you, well, she had a cough here, she had this here, but unfortunately, there's no such story. Now, as time passes on, one of the things Stephen Holgate and I also recognize is we are not able to say when Ella first became ill, because what we now know is her asthma came out when she was almost 7, and what he's not able, and we don't even know if she was alive, whether we'll be able to work it out. He firmly believes the damage was going on long before it eventually came out in October 2010. So for myself and the family, it looks rather sudden, but Stephen is of the mind that a lot was going on inside the body. And by the time it actually came out, it was basically, the die had been cast. It was actually too late. But at the time, we didn't know that. And I was out filming yesterday near the South Circular. And one of the questions one of the young men asked me was, how soon did they diagnose Ella's asthma? And I said, well, it started in October 2010, but you know, at that point, we didn't know it was asthma. Asthma is a very complicated condition. And it's very important to stress here, there is no cure for asthma. And asthma isn't something you can diagnose overnight. And especially when there's a child in front of you that you've never seen before, who's having hypoxic seizures. Even then, we didn't know there were hypoxic seizures. And to be fair to the medics, Ella started to become ill in October 2010, and by December, she was already in her first coma. So she didn't really give them a lot of chance to actually diagnose her. 2011, she was diagnosed with asthma, but those of you that tuned in to the inquest will realize Ella had a very rare and severe form of asthma. And when in the past I have gone to schools to speak to young people about the dangers of asthma, it has been incredibly important to point this out, because asthma is the most common illness amongst children in this country. It's the main reason why children miss school. I think there's about maybe 1.1 million children who have asthma. Ella continued to battle on, as we know, between 2011 and 12. And she did have some respite during 2012. Funny enough, during the Olympics, again, there doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason as to why during that period she was okay. And as most asthmatics will know, come the autumn season, September, she started to go downhill again, September 2012, and she never fully recovered until she passed away in February 2013. Her first inquest, those of you that didn't know, was done in September 2014 by the same coroner, I might add. And obviously, he concluded that she died from respiratory failure. And I think one of her doctors actually wasn't concerned, but thought respiratory failure didn't really do her justice. All the things she actually went through. Respiratory failure is something that you can be, someone of 100 could sit in a chair and suddenly pass away and they can put respiratory failure. And I think for me, as her mother, I think the reason why I wasn't satisfied after the first inquest, because it didn't answer my question why a healthy child had suddenly become so chronically ill. There was no explanation for it. We had a child death review in Lewisham, and what it concluded basically was that Ella's triggers were something to do with something in the air. That's all we knew. We didn't know anything about air pollution or anything. And during that time, I set up the foundation, and someone wrote to me, I still don't know who that person is, and actually told me that I need to have a look at the air pollution levels near my house, and especially the night before Ella passed away. And there started our long journey to prove or to have air pollution on the death certificate. We talk about all the time air pollution contributing to so many illnesses and things like that, but it was not that easy to prove. And even although I'd kept Ella's samples, which helped me and helped Stephen Holgate to ultimately prove what happened to her, it took seven years. I'm always struck when people think they can just prove. You can't prove it because, number one, you can't see it. You don't know when the damage is happening. There were many attacks Ella had, and I must stress to the audience, the only ones we tend to focus are the ones that landed her in hospital. She probably had treble the attacks that people know of, and it was incredibly frightening. What has Ella's case taught us? Ella's case, for me, has taught us that many children, many vulnerable people are affected by air pollution. And also those of you who listened into the inquest, I think maybe my frustration, let's say, is how many people knew about it, or maybe governments everywhere, and they still don't do what they should do, really. That's what I found quite shocking, the lack of action. And I remember Kathy starting off by saying that 2.4 million people had died from COVID. And I look around and see all the things that are being done. And we're not comparing deaths, but then I think 8.8 million people, the new research has shown, die from air pollution. And there really isn't that same action. Geraint mentioned that we met with the Environment Secretary and the Air Quality Minister, Rebecca Powell, and I remember the question which she asked me was, do I think more needs to be done, or do I think that people are aware of the damage of air pollution? And the answer really is no. I think people know about it, but I don't think people understand about exposure to air pollution, what that truly means, and how a child can be walking on a very busy road and a spike in air pollution can immediately affect that child's airways. And that's why whenever there's a spike in air pollution, there is, I think King's College have said, there's 1,000 more people admitted to hospital with heart attacks and asthma attacks. I think the sheer, people don't really understand really the impact, the detrimental impact of air pollution on our health. I think we've got used to talking about it now. And the reason why I say that is there's been a few policies in place which has made the pollution worse. And for someone like myself who's been through what I've been through, I don't quite understand why we've got there. I hope we are successful in regards to the Environment Bill. I hope to meet the Minister again regarding WHO guidelines. And we need to take this really seriously. I don't think the government since 2010, when we were part of the EU, I don't think they ever met any of their targets ever. And I do wonder whether that's the reason why they don't want to be held to any targets, because they've never met them at all. And maybe they feel nervous about it. Going forward, it's good to mention to people listening that we're still waiting for the coroner to come back with his recommendations. And in case people are wondering why has it taken so long, it's because of COVID. The thousands of people that have died, you know, very sadly, they need to be registered, they need to be buried. So Ella's case obviously has moved further down. But we hope when the coroner comes back with his recommendations, my team will draft Ella's law. And for me, going forward, it will be about the prevention of future deaths. And I hope we can use the new targets from WHO. The targets we're talking about, I think they're from 2005. And WHO have realized that they're not strict enough. And the reason why they're not strict enough is because there are still people dying. You know, it was 7 million, we're now almost 9 million. And for those in the know, we say at WHO, there is no such thing as a safe level. So all these targets, they might be okay for people who are healthy, but for children like my late daughter, these targets are not even strict. And unless there's zero, it's, you know, Ella, if she was here now, would still be struggling to breathe. You know, the air, unfortunately, we had a period during lockdown where no child died from asthma, which was great. And now we are back to where we were in 2017. So I do have grave concerns going forward, not just the UK government, governments everywhere, not taking this seriously. And one of the reasons why, it is invisible and it's incredibly difficult to prove, and they are able to get away with it. So I will continue to campaign, and I would like all your support on Ella's law. And my barrister Ravi, he personally believes that the Environment Bill is not even strong enough. So we would like Ella's law to be stronger, and we are aiming that clean air becomes an actual human right. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you so much, Rosamond. Really stirring. So thank you very much for that contribution. So we as an organisation will be pleased to help along the way, however we can, whether that's spreading the word, whether that's writing to MPs, however we can help, just let us know. I'm sure our audience have got some questions for Rosamond. So I've got nothing in the Q&A function at the moment, but just let me just ask you a quick question. So, I mean, I used to go to school in Lee, just next door to Lewisham.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that air pollution has got better or got worse over the years?
I had a moment last year, Simon, when suddenly, as we all know, during the first lockdown, but it took transport to be down 90% in order. Right. But there was a moment that
there was a moment, wasn't there?
Yeah, there was a moment that everybody enjoyed. I feel really differently about it now. I sort of really wanted clean air, and then suddenly all these people were dying. So it was quite hard to,
Yes.
it was quite hard to really enjoy the moments. But at least now people know what clean air is. I do think there was a whole generation plus some who had never seen clean air before. So at least now people know what it is. But how do we get there and how do we maintain it? That is the issue. To me, it seems like there's clean air on one side and there's the economy on the other side. In my opinion, that's what the battle lines really seem to be. The economy and clean air. Other people may have a different view on that, but that's what it is looking. You know, getting Ella's landmark victory was a start, but it's going to be a battle to get clean air recognised as a human right. Make no bones about it. It will open some doors, yes, but I think governments all over the world know how difficult it is to achieve. But we can't have 8.8 million people dying every year. I mean, look what's happened with COVID, and that's 2.4 million. So it shows you how much more needs to be done regarding air pollution. We get away with it because it is invisible. And also, we don't put air pollution on death certificates. And that's something I'm going to be pushing for when they do postmortems, whether they could look to see whether it's quite controversial. And I don't know, they'll have to go through an ethics committee. And I wondered if more people who died, you know, if someone died from a heart attack suddenly and they had to do a postmortem, could they look out for PM2 and things like that? I wonder if the more people that these particulates were inside their body, like my late daughter, whether it will begin to be taken more seriously. She's the only person in the world currently who has air pollution on a death certificate, and yet we know it contributes to millions more premature dying. So maybe that needs to change a bit.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So we've had a few comments come in on the Q&A. So maybe Kate Brown, maybe I can ask you, Kate, and Richard to unmute Kate, and we can ask Kate to make a comment and ask her question. It's more really of a statement, but I think it's quite a useful one. Can you organise that, Richard? Richard's gone quiet on me. So I'm just going to read out Kate's statement. So she says, thank you, Rosamond, with your moving presentation. Clean air as a human right sounds like a system scale solution that could have so many other co-benefits. And I think that's so right. And Ben has made a comment in the chat saying that in London, you know, if there are something like 3,700 car journeys, and yet we've got one of the best public services and public transport systems in the world. And so surely we should be pushing people onto that and leaving their cars behind.
Well, we do know that people are nervous right now due to COVID. And because this sounds like I'm plugging vaccination. I am really not, but I don't see any way out of this situation at the moment, apart from being vaccinated. People would need to regain confidence to get back onto public transport. We are not there. We are far from it right now. Let's see what happens after the 8th of March. I think a somber note to end on, sadly, is if COVID is here to stay, as the experts are saying, having poor air quality is going to make things worse. Based on the studies I've been reading, it's going to make it worse, I'm afraid. So yet again, this is another reason to clean up the air. If we want, you know, COVID to sort of, the virus to die down, then my advice would be to the Prime Minister to look at air pollution. You clean up the air, because there seems to be a correlation between high areas of air pollution and COVID deaths. So if air pollution remains high, then COVID is, no amount of vaccination is going to help that, I'm afraid. I don't hear much about the, you know, sort of about people's behavior and things like that. But this is a sober warning. I hate when I say that, because someone will come back to me and say to me, remember when you said a year ago, And normally, unfortunately, these things turn out, because air pollution seems to be linked to any disease, you know, and this is a respiratory virus, but we don't say it enough. It is a respiratory virus. And I think it's very important to keep on saying that.
Yeah, no, absolutely wise words. And thanks for that reminder. So just to say to everybody that Geraint Davis has kindly put into our chat a sample letter to your local MP. So it's really a case of just copying and pasting that onto a Word document and sending that out. So it would be great if we could sort of start our campaigning work on this here and do that.
Simon, very quickly, before I go, can I just say what Garrett is pushing for regarding the environmental bill? It is crucial. This is a once in a lifetime chance. We can't miss this opportunity to get WHO guidelines because once the bill goes through, that's it. So we really, really need to up the pressure. And I'm hoping Geraint and I are going to have another meeting with the Environment Secretary and the Air Quality Minister before the Queen's speech. I think I can't stress enough how crucial, how important these guidelines are part of the Environment Bill, because once it becomes law, that's it.
Okay, so call to arms, everybody. So there's a call to action from both Geraint and Rosamond, and so it'd be great if you can respond to that. So I've got a comment from Cyprian Edmonds in the Q&A. So Cyprian is saying car idling besides schools is an issue that's been highlighted of late. What do you think we should do about that to stop the air pollution from car idling and schools?
We've been talking about idling now, I don't know, maybe 2-3 years. I did an assembly in Ellis Primary School about idling quite a few years ago now. And I'm afraid to answer to say enforcement, sadly, is the only way forward. Obviously, we need to raise awareness about it, but I think majority of people that I have seen idling, who I have approached, it's not that they don't know about it. It's either a habit, a terrible bad habit, or because the enforcements are not strong enough. In the area they are idling, 50% more air pollution. It's a terrible habit. So maybe the councils need to become more serious about enforcing it. We have tried to talk to people. We generally have for the last 2 to 3 years, and we don't seem to be getting far. People are either charging their mobile phone, or it's too cold, or we had one summer when someone told me they need to leave their air conditioning on because it is too hot.
Too hot.
So people don't take it. It's by the way, it is against the law. May I stress on that one? Idling is against the law, and maybe the government might want to do proper signage for it, so people can take it more seriously. Yeah. Apparently they are reluctant, but as it's such a huge issue, maybe they would reconsider it.
Okay, yeah, no, good point. So as we start to ease lockdown, I mean, like yourself, I'm in sort of two minds about it all, because what we know will happen is that air pollution surely will just get worse. Now you feel will be a great opportunity to try and, you know, have this building back better thing, and, you know, learning from COVID and so on will be a great opportunity to try and make sure that doesn't happen. But you know, it's a complex area. We can all do our bit, that's for sure. So, well, thank you so much, Rosamond. We've really, really enjoyed your time and your very kind contribution to our seminar today. I'm very pleased that I'm going to put you in touch with Kath Noakes after this. I don't know whether you know Kath, but I was hoping that you might get some more work on the lecture circuit. So if anybody's looking for Rosamond to come in and meet her students, she's keen to try and do some more of that.
Thank you very much, Simon. Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome, and thank you so much for your lovely contribution. Really enjoyed your listening to you. So thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, so I'm going to now move on to our last speaker for this session. So we're going to have a broader look. So we've looked at mental health, we've looked at products, we've looked at indoor air quality, and we've heard from Ben just a mention of acoustics and how important this is when it comes to healthy buildings. And so I'm sure most of us have had experience where we've sort of listened to the neighbours have a row, or we've listened to unwanted music through the wall. And of course, it's a complex science, but I'm hoping that Jack is going to make it simple and easy for us to understand. So I'd like to welcome Jack Harvey-Clark from Apex, who's coming to talk to us now. So I'll ask you to share your screen, Jack, and I'll hand over the virtual baton microphone to you and ask you to kick off.
Hi, thank you very much, Simon. Can you hear me and see my screen there?
We can, thanks, Jack. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so thank you for that introduction. And I'm not going to be so ambitious to teach you all about acoustics, but thank you very much for the introduction to talk here. And great to hear from all those speakers earlier. What a wide range of perspectives on the built environment. And hopefully this is another one that will contribute to that. So I'm going to be talking about acoustics for regenerative design, thinking beyond sustainability. Much of what I'm going to talk about is considered, if you like, in the context of sustainability in terms of avoiding harm. I've been doing acoustics, been an acoustic consultant for 20 years. I've been involved in lots of things. I was a mechanical engineer for 10 years before that as well. I've got involved in lots of things like writing BB93 and the testing guidance for that. And I've been a technical advisor to the government on the recent consultations to Part F and the overheating part, which I'll talk about a little bit. And I'm also on the well concept, the well found concept advisory, so helping them to improve those standards. So yeah, Apex Acoustics. So we work across the built environment and across the country in all areas of acoustics, really. And we win lots of prizes for our acoustics too. Well on that. So a regenerative vision, and it's great to see the Good Homes Alliance manifesto in 2020. Look at this. I'm sure everybody here is aware of sometimes that the sustainability agenda is described as avoiding doing harm, so enabling us to continue what we're doing. And the regenerative vision is how can we actually improve places, both for the environment and for people. And my question is, what does that mean for acoustics? So how do we do regenerative design, thinking about the acoustic design of places? And today I'm going to focus on residential design, really, and the environmental design for that. But this concept, if you like, is probably nicely illustrated in this diagram. So we can think of increasing sound level as we go towards the right, and a threshold above which there's a we can say there's an adverse impact from the noise level. And the traditional approach to acoustics, if you like, is a noise control approach, where we look at reducing noise levels in general. And I'm definitely going to talk about that this morning. There's been some suggestions that actually below that level, we've got an opportunity to improve the environment for people, to encourage those positive responses. And that threshold, though, is very interesting, because although it says there that it might depend on the performed task, the control opportunities, because control is very important when it comes to noise and an often forgotten about aspect, and exposure time, but it's also very personal. Some people like to work in busy environments. They used to go to coffee shops, for example, to work, whereas other people couldn't possibly contemplate working in a coffee shop and they would need it to be quiet. So it's a very personal thing, as well as depending on the context. And I think there's not enough attention often given to that aspect of acoustics, and we're often very intolerant of other people's personal preferences when it comes to acoustics. If we go back a step and think why sound is so important to us, why do we have hearing in the first place? So that young deer, that impala there, is about to get eaten by that eater. But look at the size of its ears. They are part of its early warning system. Our sense of sound developed to keep us safe from predators. So sound is deeply wired into our brains. It's designed to cause agitation. Sound is designed to agitate us. That's how we've evolved to keep us safe from predators. And of course, the most common use of sound these days is to communicate with each other. Sound is not just something we do with our ears. Have a look at this and listen to this.
Ba, 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 ba.
But look what happens when we change the picture.
Ba, 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 ba.
And yet, the sound hasn't changed. In every clip, you are only ever hearing ba with a B.
Ba, ba, ba.
It's an illusion.
So that's the McGurk effect. Which they're describing there as an optical illusion, but of course, really, I would say it's an auditory illusion, which is not really a very common term we even have. So we hear not just with our ears, but our perception of sounds is strongly dominated by what we see and what we expect to hear. And in this one, you can hear the birds tweeting. The zoom, unfortunately, squashes this, but you get the best sound at the beginning. If you could hear the birds tweeting there. And the sense of the waterfall. The other thing that soundscape teaches us, which is a occupant perception of the sound environment, is that we like sounds that have our natural sounds, and we dislike sounds from human sources. So transportation sounds in particular, of course, we dislike. And sound has a huge negative impact on our health. And so the biggest impacts are annoyance and sleep disturbance by quite a long way, actually. But also because of the way sound is wired into us, and obviously we can't close our ears, it increases our stress physiologically. So it increases our heart rate, it puts us at increased risk of all types of cardiovascular disease. How big is this problem? The World Health Organization did a big review a decade ago now to quantify the burden of disease from environmental noise. And it is the second biggest burden of environmental disease after air pollution. They came, I should say there's 1.5 million healthy life years lost across Western Europe every year a decade ago. And in 2018, they produced some guidelines, what levels of noise we should seek to achieve to avoid adverse effects from noise, environmental noise. They come out with these numbers with a strong recommendation, 53 decibels LDEN, that's an average of day, evening and night noise levels, and 45 dBl night. Now, more than 80% of dwellings in the UK are exposed to levels above 53 dB LDEN, and more than 65% of dwellings are exposed to levels above 45 dBl night. Maybe why that is why noise has such a big burden of disease for us all. We don't meet these recommendations at all. We're a long way away from them. If we dig a little bit deeper and see where that data's come from, the regression looks like this. So each of those different colored dots is a different study from a different study. So the results from within those studies will be even wider. But you can see at 53 dB LDEN, we've got sound level, if you like, on this axis, and we've got the percentage of people who are highly annoyed by noise on this axis. You can look at the range at 53 dB LDEN from the different studies, and that goes from less than 5% to nearly 40% of people being highly annoyed. So clearly noise level is important, but it's not the only factor. It's only one part of the environment that we experience. What we need to do, of course, is think about the internal environment holistically, because we don't experience noise on its own. We also have the air quality, the thermal comfort, and the most common interaction that people think of course, is opening the windows for their thermal comfort. It lets the noise in, and that balance. How are these things designed? How do we manage these things generally in the industry at the minute? Well, we eventually went through 160 planning applications from London that had to have both. They were major developments. They had both overheating assessments and noise assessments done. So you know what I'm going to say here. 85% of those planning applications, the overheating assessment assumed that the windows were open to mitigate overheating. So they got a tick in the box like that. This won't overheat. And at the same time, the noise assessment assumed that the windows were closed so that people could enjoy reasonable noise conditions. So obviously incompatible assumptions for the occupants. That meant there was no way of assessing the acoustic conditions that people were exposed to when they had to rely on opening windows for their thermal comfort. That was one of the reasons that we wrote the Acoustics, Ventilation, Overheating Residential Design Guide. We didn't do this all by ourselves. There was a big cross-industry group through the Association of Noise Consultants that I organised when I was chair of the association. And what this is jointly published by the Institute of Acoustics as well, and is actually referenced in the new building regulations consultation. What this does is considers environmental noise and noise from building services separately, because people respond differently to these different sources of noise. I'm sure everybody's got experience of noisy ventilation fans. What do you do with it? If it's annoying, you turn it off. So what happens if people have noisy ventilation systems in their homes? They turn them off and almost never turn them back on again. So actually the level of building services noise that is intolerable is the noise level when you're trying to get to sleep, because that's when everything else is quietest and you're most at risk, if you like, being annoyed by that noise. That's got nothing to do with environmental noise affecting your sleep while you are asleep. Then we address what the conditions that we call ventilation, so that's for indoor air quality, and the provisions for mitigating overheating, which is usually opening windows. And we assess them separately for the different sources of noise. So we can think about the indoor environment in a slightly holistic manner. Right now, of course, you might have seen that there is a consultation on the new Part L and Part F of the building regs. And that includes this approved document X for overheating. This consultation includes a section on ensuring the overheating strategy is usable, and it includes some noise levels. Fantastic. So they mostly wrote it themselves, but I did give them a little bit of advice on this. And the number they've got in there at the minute, 40 dB as an average when you're using your provisions for mitigating overheating. About 30% of dwellings in the UK currently won't meet that standard. So this is going to have a huge impact on how people have to build. So I'd strongly encourage you to respond to this consultation, but this is obviously the annual average level that you would like to achieve would be 30 dBA. So that's a big relaxation on the standards that would be preferable to avoid any adverse effects. This is the balance. As Rosamund said, between the economy and the cost of building and the cost of people's comfort and their health. What can you do if you can't use opening windows to mitigate overheating? And the easiest thing, unfortunately, is to resort to mechanical means, either a mechanical ventilation system, and that would be a separate mechanical ventilation system than that you need for your indoor air quality to meet building regulations, because you usually need to supply a lot more air if you're using ventilative cooling or mechanical cooling. Obviously, those are both less sustainable than passive options. We've done, of course, all the research we could together from around the world to look at what options there are to provide passive ventilative cooling. And it looks a little bit like this. And the answer is it's pretty hard. So there are attenuated windows, so double windows. Architects don't like these very much. So the Danes have done a lot of research on this. So they work acoustically, but obviously get much less airflow through them. They're not very effective for ventilation. Expensive, and you don't get that sense of connection with the outside because you can't put your hand through or see directly outside. Lots of work's been done on a similar configuration in Hong Kong and Singapore for the public housing programs there. So huge blocks. This block was just built as this white building as a prototype to test the different schemes. Can't imagine that happening for public housing in this country. And they just want to extend the season for which people can use natural ventilated cooling. They're still going to give them air conditioning. They want them to be able to use it less often. Balconies are pretty hard to use, and there's very few examples of them actually being used in practice. So these are all things which have huge implications for the design of the facade if you're going to try and use them. So it's obviously far too late to start incorporating these at planning stage if you've already designed your building. Attenuated vents look like they would offer a solution. And this is from a scheme in Northwest Cambridge where 5 different architects took a different response to the requirement. They had the planning made them think about this, which was ahead of its time to a certain extent. So that section in the window reveal has it's a grille. You can see it in the inside of the room there. So in there, there's a damper, electrically operated damper, which has to maintain the weather tightness and the air tightness, and the thermal performance of the building envelope when it's closed. That's to let the air through when it's open. Because of the number of components you have in there, obviously restricts the airflow. So the effective area of that is much smaller than its physical size. And if you think, well, how big a window do you need to mitigate overheating? That obviously depends on the thermal design, but the equivalent size of a window compared to that vent is much smaller, maybe a third of the size. So if you had a window the third of that size, you'd say, well, that's not going to be big enough instinctively to mitigate overheating. And these solutions probably wouldn't meet the M59 if you've done any overheating assessments recently. This has been built and it has solar shading externally. The other main question about these things is, will people use these things? How will people respond? How will they know to use them? And will they use them with external solar shading and the passive ventilation? In this one, there's a higher level of attenuation, and the attenuator fills this whole section here. So this is part of a refurbishment scheme. So a massive ventilator, and then it has a fan in it. So increase the airflow when you need it and provide more airflow. And that looks like they're much more practical way to go, unfortunately, than entirely passive solutions. But we need things that people will use. That's always obviously a difficulty when you're designing new things, when you have new design criteria and have to think of noise and thermal comfort at the same time. So we need post-occupancy evaluation of these things that are being put out there. But most of all, you need to ask your acoustician more questions. Ask them about how the acoustics integrate with the other aspects of the internal environment. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Jack. That's really, really useful. So please keep your questions coming in, pop them in the Q&A, and we'll ask Jack. So whilst people are doing that, I'm going to ask you a question. So am I right in thinking that if you're looking to reduce acoustic transmission, that the density really of your insulation, say, for example, is the most important parameter? Or is that such a complicated area that we won't have enough time to really do it justice?
That's a question. So if you're asking about sound insulation of materials,
yep.
Stop sharing my screen there. Then a heavy material naturally provides more sound insulation than a light material as a single leaf. But if you think of a stud wall, for example, it has a sheet of plasterboard on both sides. So for the sound to be transmitted from one side to the other, the vibration in the air on one side has to first of all vibrate one panel. That vibration has to be transmitted across to the panel on the other side. And that happens through the air in the cavity and through the timber studs. And so you can see that's actually a very complicated transmission mechanism.
Okay, we should probably do a whole session just on that. I think there's a real there'd be a real appetite for that from the sort of geeky, nerdy folk amongst us. So thank you for that. All right, so I've got a question here actually, which is actually aimed at Rosminda Geraint. So I see that Geraint is still with us, which is lovely. Thank you so much for hanging on. So Kate, I don't know whether we can ask you to, Richard can wield his magic wand and unmute you, and you can ask your questions. So keep your questions coming in for Jack, and we'll put those to him before we wrap up at 1:45. So Kate, thank you.
Hi, thanks ever so much, Geraint. I wanted to ask whether, a bit more about what you were proposing in the Environment Bill for indoor air pollution, and whether you were working with the community in construction with looking at ways that construction can reduce the transmission of air pollution from outside to inside, because obviously that's a big source of indoor pollution, though not the only one. So I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about how you were linking the two.
Thank you very much, Kate. Can I very quickly, can I just make a comment before I forget it about what Jack's saying? And that is, I forgot to mention, it's my view, this might not, be popular for everyone, that there's a case to be made for even plastic partitions between pedestrians and traffic. This is for air quality reasons to start with, because this is a gradient of particulates as you go further from the traffic. And that would also insulate them from noise, which Jack was focusing on. And it might be possible that if you had nearby partitions, that actually this noise wouldn't then reverberate so easily up to buildings. And in terms of what he was talking about, which was, what to do about buildings, the other end of the telescope, if you like, is what to do about the noise sources and whether we can insulate at source to reduce the requirement on buildings to be noise insulated, as it were. So I just thought I'd be interested in what Jack thinks about that. And then on Kate's point, as it were, I'm not in charge of the Environment Bill, of course. The Environment, this is a government bill, and I've been suggesting various amendments to the bill, and that would include including a duty on government to consider indoor air quality and basically set targets. As Kate just said, there is a sort of cocktail impact of outdoor air pollution and indoor air pollution. And what basically happens is that the indoor air pollution comes in and mixes up with all sorts of chemicals and causes further respiratory inflammatory problems. So we need to sort of bear that in mind. But if there were targets generally, then there should be duties really on local government and others to ensure construction materials and the like don't have, I don't know, VOCs and various products in your building materials and the like, apart from the chemicals to protect you. So I have separately been sort of working on and published a Clean Air Bill, and we need to sort of keeping on to put greater pressure on government to improve indoor air quality. But the basic first step is to say government should have a responsibility to do whatever it can to improve indoor air quality, and to a certain extent the other strategies then follow through. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. Sorry, I muted myself.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks for that, and thanks, Geraint. So I've got another question coming in from Anne Vanna. So maybe Richard, we can unmute Anne, and she can ask her question.
Afternoon.
Hi, Anne. Thank you.
I've just been listening to a lot about sort of biophilia and things like that, and how plants can help, whether it's to do with air quality, indoor air quality, and with noise pollution as well.
Yeah, this is probably the subject of another seminar entirely, I would suggest. Geraint, I don't know if you've got any comments?
Yeah, well, I do. I mean, I think there's a very strong case, by way of example, for schools to have, you know, natural barriers, hedging and the like, particularly the near to roads. I think there's been some research, as Alice has mentioned, about, you know, obviously the benefits of having indoor plants, and obviously you've got to look after them and this sort of thing. But yeah, but generally, obviously, I'd encourage more natural plant use for both. But I'll leave it there.
Could I jump in possibly quickly, Simon, on that?
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
So I'm always an optimist, but that said, unfortunately, a lot of the research shows plants, hedges, etc., and I'm sure Jack will probably back me up on this, are not actually that great when it comes to acoustics. They don't provide a great acoustic buffer, particularly for low frequency noises. What you actually need are things that are more dense, rigid materials. So earth banks, for example, are actually a much better acoustic barrier than, say, hedges or planting or trees. Really, they don't make a huge difference. And when it comes to air quality, again, the research is quite mixed. It's something I've been looking into quite a lot lately, something I'm really interested in. And because particularly plants can play a massive role in our mental health, we know they can improve performance, memory, mood, all of these things. But in terms of air cleansing, some plants are definitely better than others. It also depends on kind of lots of other factors, like how much daylight they're getting. So for example, when plants get more daylight, they actually process sort of particulate matter and all that kind of stuff more quickly. They clean the air better. But it's really important to say, to actually use them on their own as an air cleaning device, you would need to pretty much live in a jungle. So they can play a role, but you need to pick the right plants and use them as part of a joined up overall air cleansing strategy.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Okay, nice intervention. Thank you for that.
Can I comment on the noise things?
Please do. Yeah, absolutely.
What you said, Ben, is, and thank you for the question, Garen, as well, is entirely true. That vegetation doesn't reduce measurably the noise levels, but people feel less annoyed by the noise if they're looking at vegetation. So there is a benefit. So the traditional acoustic approach, if you like thinking of noise control, says there's no benefit to vegetation, but actually it improves people's perception. They feel like it's less noisy. People are also less annoyed by noise if they're within 5 minutes of a green space. So if they can walk to a park close by, they're less annoyed by the noise in front of their house. So that's...
Yeah, okay, thank you, Jack. That's a really good point, isn't it? Okay, I've got a question here from Kate. So to Jack. So perhaps, Richard, we can ask Kate to unmute and we can get her to ask her question of Jack.
Yeah, here we go.
Thank you.
Oh dear, me again. Sorry. Yeah, Jack, we're talking about how using mechanical ventilation in place of natural ventilation was obviously less sustainable and less desirable. But I mean, is it sometimes the least worst thing to do in a really noisy environment, or do you just have to devote a whole room in the house to the size of the fan you'd need? I just want to get a sense of the scale.
Yes, so it's definitely possible. And obviously the amount of ventilation you need to mitigate overheating depends on the exposure to overheating. And if we take it back 2 steps, the best thing, of course, to do is to reduce the problem. So reduce the traffic, put it somewhere else, or not use noise barriers, as you were saying earlier, Garrett. And we don't see noise barriers very often in this country, or low noise surfaces, for example, because of the way we cost the impact of noise. Whereas as soon as you go onto the continent, you see noise barriers everywhere around motorways. Linked back to the earlier point. But it's definitely possible to use oversized MVHR, but that's not always. It depends on the particular design, because if you oversize your MVHR, it won't work very efficiently for all those times when you're not using it to mitigate overheating. It'll be less energy efficient in those times because it's not correctly sized for the job. But I have seen people even suggest putting 2 MVHR systems in, for example, a flat, and that you would use the extra one to try and provide the extra ventilation to mitigate overheating. So there's all different sorts of solutions coming out, and there's not one way to do it yet, for sure.
No. Okay, thank you so much. All right, I'm going to have to call the event to a close. There's one more question in the Q&A for you, Jack. So there's a question from Jola there. I was wondering perhaps if I can ask you to spend just a moment responding to that. That would be lovely. So a huge thank you to our amazing speakers today. I really have enjoyed your contributions. Thank you so much for your time. So the guarantors pasted in, as I mentioned previously, into the chat, a standard letter for you to copy and paste and send to your MP. So that would be great if you can do that. Yeah, huge thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you to the audience for staying with us. So this afternoon we have a free event, so try and see if you can make some time for that. So we've got our Innovation Pitch Series final. So we have 7 companies jousting against each other to win the grand finale, and you as the audience get to vote. So I'm looking forward to that. Should be quite interesting. I'm so pleased that I'm not a judge, but we've got some excellent judges there. And then tomorrow afternoon we've got our awards, which is a really interesting selection of shortlisted winners there. I think they should all win personally, so I hope you can join us for that. Sign up via our website through Eventbrite, or if you really can't do that, then just drop Larry a note. All right, everybody. Well, thank you so much. I hope you've enjoyed the sessions this morning. I certainly have. And we look forward to seeing some of you this afternoon and tomorrow. So thank you very much from us. And thanks once again to all our speakers, and cheerio.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.